April 1945. The sky over the Rhine Valley trembles with the drone of engines. Oberleutnant Klaus Bergmann banks his Focke-Wulf 190 through thin clouds, eyes scanning the horizon for Allied bombers. Instead, he sees something else. A formation of C-47 Skytrains, flying low and slow, their bellies open. Black shapes tumble out, spinning downward. Parachutes bloom white against the gray morning. But these are not men. They are too large, too angular. Bergman throttles forward, descending for a closer look. His radio crackles with confusion from other pilots. The objects swing beneath their canopies, square and metallic. They strike the earth in open fields behind enemy lines. The parachutes collapse. And then, impossibly, the machines move. Engines start. Wheels turn. American soldiers climb aboard and drive away, vanishing into the trees. Bergman pulls up hard, his mind racing. He reports what he saw, but his voice carries disbelief. The Americans are dropping vehicles from the sky. Vehicles that drive themselves the moment they land. By 1943, the United States faced a problem that no army in history had solved. Airborne forces, dropped deep behind enemy lines, were lethal in their initial strike. Paratroopers seized bridges, cut supply routes, and sowed chaos in rear areas. But once on the ground, they became vulnerable. They carried only what they could jump with: rifles, ammunition, grenades, maybe a mortar. No heavy weapons, no vehicles, no resupply beyond what came in gliders or later drops. They were light infantry in hostile territory, often surrounded, always outnumbered. The Germans knew this. They had learned it in Crete in 1941, when their own Fallschirmjägers suffered devastating losses despite initial success. Airborne soldiers were shock troops, not occupation forces. Without mobility and firepower, they could be isolated and destroyed. The Allies under Varsity viewed this limitation acutely after the disasters of early operations. In Sicily in July 1943, American and British paratroopers scattered across miles of unfamiliar terrain, many drowning in the sea or shot in their harnesses. Those who survived the drop spent hours, sometimes days, trying to regroup. By the time they assembled, the Germans had repositioned. The element of surprise was gone. The same pattern repeated in Normandy on D-Day. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions landed in darkness, confused and fragmented. Some units achieved their objectives through sheer grit. Others never found their rallying points. The problem was not courage, it was logistics. Airborne troops needed speed, firepower, and above all, mobility. They needed vehicles. But how do you drop a vehicle from an airplane? The Willys MB Jeep had already become the symbol of American mechanization. Compact, durable, capable of carrying 4 men or half a ton of supplies, it was the workhorse of the U.S. Army. By 1943, over 300,000 had been produced. They served in every theater, every climate, every terrain. Infantry divisions used them for reconnaissance. Artillery units towed guns with them. Medics transformed them into ambulances. The Jeep was not just a vehicle. It was a platform, a system, a solution. If airborne forces could have Jeeps on the ground within minutes of landing, everything changed. They could consolidate faster, move heavier weapons, evacuate wounded, pursue objectives before the enemy reacted. The question was not whether the Jeep should go airborne. The question was, how? The first answer was gliders. The Waco CG-4A, a plywood and canvas coffin with wings, could carry a Jeep and a crew. Towed behind a C-47, released over the landing zone, it descended in silence and landed hard, sometimes very hard. Gliders broke apart on impact, killing their passengers. They could not be reused. They required precise landing zones, flat and obstacle-free. And once down, they were immobile wrecks cluttering the battlefield. Still, gliders worked. On D-Day, dozens of Jeeps reached Normandy this way. But the cost was high and the method was slow. For every Jeep that arrived intact, another was destroyed in a crash landing. The Army needed a better system. They needed to drop Jeeps the same way they dropped men, by parachute. Engineers at Wright Field in Ohio began experimenting in late 1943. The challenge was immense. A loaded Jeep weighed over 20,300 pounds. Parachutes strong enough to slow that mass had to be enormous, and the impact forces on landing would crush the vehicle unless absorbed somehow. The solution required rethinking the Jeep itself. Technicians stripped away everything non-essential. Windshields were folded flat or removed. Seats were lightened. Fuel tanks were drained to minimum levels. The chassis was reinforced at stress points. Engineers designed a breakaway wooden platform that cradled the Jeep during descent, absorbing the shock of landing and then falling away, leaving the vehicle free to drive. 5 parachutes, each 24 feet in diameter, were clustered above the cargo bundle. The total system weighed over 3,000 pounds. It took a team of riggers an hour to prepare one Jeep for a drop, but in theory, it would work. The first test drop happened in early 1944. The Jeep hit the ground hard, bounced, settled. The parachutes collapsed. A test driver climbed in, turned the ignition, and drove away. The system was operational. Training began immediately. Rigger crews at bases across the United States and Britain practiced bundling Jeeps with obsessive precision. Every strap had to be tensioned exactly. Every knot had to hold under violent canopy deployment. A single error could send a Jeep tumbling through the air, smashing into paratroopers or friendly aircraft. The margin for mistake was zero. Loadmasters learned to position the cargo bundles inside C-47s so their center of gravity matched the aircraft's balance. Pilots trained to fly at exact altitudes and speeds for the drop. Too low, and the parachutes would not deploy fully. Too high, and the Jeep would drift miles off target. The drop had to happen at 500 feet, at 110 miles per hour, over a confirmed drop zone. Navigation was critical. Radio silence was mandatory. Everything depended on timing, coordination, and nerve. Meanwhile, airborne infantry units received their own training. Soldiers learned to identify cargo parachutes by their color and size. They practiced rushing to drop zones, locating the bundles, cutting away rigging, and starting the Jeeps under fire. Speed was everything. A Jeep sitting idle on a field was a target. A Jeep moving became a tactical advantage. Crews rehearsed loading ammunition, mounting machine guns, and driving cross-country under blackout conditions. They memorized emergency procedures for when parachutes failed or Jeeps landed in trees, rivers, or enemy positions. They learned to accept that some drops would fail. Some Jeeps would be destroyed on impact. Some would land in minefields or swamps. But enough would survive to make the difference. That was the gamble. The first operational use of airdrop Jeeps came during the preparation for D-Day. Planners realized that the bocage country of Normandy, with its sunken roads and dense hedgerows, would trap airborne units unless they had vehicles. Gliders could bring some, but not enough. On the night of June 5, 1944, several Jeeps were dropped with the 82nd Airborne Division near Sainte-Mère-Église. Many landed in flooded fields and sank. Others drifted into German-held villages, but a handful reached their intended zones. Paratroopers found them in the darkness, freed them from their rigging, and drove them into action before dawn. One Jeep, equipped with a .30 caliber machine gun, was used to ambush a German patrol moving toward a drop zone. Another evacuated wounded men to an aid station 5 miles away. These were small victories, almost invisible in the chaos of the invasion, but they proved the concept. Jeeps could be delivered by air, and they could change the outcome on the ground. By late 1944, the system had been refined. Improved parachutes reduced the impact force. Better rigging cut preparation time. Pilots became more accurate. Airborne divisions began requesting Jeep drops as standard procedure for major operations. Intelligence reports from the European theater noted that German forces were increasingly surprised by the speed at which American paratroopers consolidated after landing. Captured Wehrmacht officers mentioned in interrogations that they had expected isolated, lightly armed troops. Instead, they encountered mobile units with machine guns, radios, and the ability to maneuver rapidly. The Germans did not yet understand how this was happening. They assumed the Americans were using more gliders, or that ground forces were linking up faster than expected. The truth, that vehicles were falling from the sky under parachutes, was too strange to believe. The German Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was struggling. By 1944, fuel shortages, pilot losses, and Allied air superiority had reduced German fighter strength to a shadow of its former capability. Luftwaffe pilots still flew, still fought, but their sorties were fewer and more desperate. When they encountered Allied cargo planes, they attacked when possible. But the Americans had learned to protect their transports with fighter escorts. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs orbited above drop zones, hunting for interceptors. The skies over occupied Europe had become an American domain. Still, some German pilots managed to observe the drops. They saw the parachutes, the cargo bundles, the strange behavior of American forces on the ground. Reports filtered back to Luftwaffe command, vague and confused. Pilots described vehicles falling from aircraft. Intelligence officers dismissed these accounts as exaggeration or misidentification. After all, dropping a functional vehicle by parachute seemed impossible. The technology required was beyond anything Germany had attempted. The reports were filed and forgotten until the spring of 1945, when the Rhine crossings began. Then the German pilots saw for themselves, and the disbelief turned to alarm. Oberleutnant Klaus Bergmann had flown 127 combat missions by April 1945. He had fought over France, the Low Countries, and now the shrinking borders of the Reich itself. He had seen burning bombers spiral into the earth, had watched entire formations of his comrades shot down in a single engagement. He knew fear. He knew exhaustion. But what he saw over the Rhine that morning was different. It was not fear. It was confusion. The cargo planes flew in tight formation, unescorted for once, slow and vulnerable. Bergmann armed his cannons, preparing to attack. Then the doors opened, the bundles dropped, the parachutes bloomed, and the shape of the objects beneath them was wrong. They were not supply crates. They were too symmetrical, too mechanical. Bergmann descended, throttling back, trying to understand. Other pilots in his squadron radioed in. They saw it too. The bundles hit the ground. The parachutes collapsed, and then engines started. Wheels rolled. The objects were vehicles. American soldiers climbed aboard and drove away. Bergmann pulled up and circled. He did not attack. His mind was calculating. If the Americans could drop vehicles anywhere at any time, then the entire defensive strategy was obsolete. German forces relied on static positions, minefields, and delayed counterattacks. They assumed airborne landings would create pockets of isolated enemy troops that could be contained and eliminated before reinforcements arrived. But if those troops had vehicles immediately, if they could move heavy weapons and supplies within minutes of landing, then containment was impossible. The Americans could strike deep, consolidate fast, and advance before German reserves even knew where to go. Bergmann landed at his base an hour later. He filed a report. His commanding officer read it, frowned, and forwarded it to higher command. The response came back 2 days later. In confirmed. Possibly misidentified gliders. Bergmann did not argue. He flew his next mission and said nothing more. But he knew what he had seen, and he knew the war was already lost. Private First Class Danny Kowalski jumped over the Rhine on March 24, 1945, as part of Operation Varsity. He was a radio man with the 17th Airborne Division, carrying a 40-pound SCR-300 radio strapped to his back. He landed hard in a plowed field, rolled, cut away his chute, and lay flat as machine gun fire ripped overhead. Around him, hundreds of paratroopers were doing the same, landing, scrambling for cover, returning fire. The drop had been chaotic. His unit was scattered across half a mile. He had no idea where his lieutenant was. He had no orders. He had only his rifle, his radio, and the knowledge that somewhere nearby, a jeep was supposed to be waiting. Kowalski low-crawled toward a hedgerow, linked up with 3 other troopers, and spotted the cargo parachutes 200 yards east. They ran. German mortars began falling, throwing up geysers of dirt. One man went down, hit in the leg. They dragged him. They reached the bundle. The parachutes were tangled in a tree, but the jeep itself was intact, still strapped to its wooden platform. Kowalski and the others tore at the rigging with knives, hands shaking. The breakaway cradle fell apart. The jeep rolled free. One of the troopers jumped in, turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, roared to life. They loaded the wounded man into the back seat. Kowalski climbed in with his radio. They drove. Within 5 minutes, they were a mile from the drop zone, moving toward the rally point. The jeep gave them speed, firepower, and hope. Without it, they would still have been pinned in that field, waiting for the Germans to close in. The system that allowed a jeep to fall from 500 feet and drive away was a masterpiece of practical engineering. It began with the parachutes. 5 canopies, each made of reinforced nylon, were clustered on a single steel frame. The combined drag force slowed the descent to roughly 25 feet per second, still a violent impact, but survivable for a reinforced vehicle. The parachutes deployed in sequence, not simultaneously, to avoid sudden deceleration that could snap suspension components. The deployment was triggered by a static line, the same system used for paratroopers, ensuring immediate canopy opening after release. Beneath the parachutes, the Jeep was secured to a honeycomb wooden platform designed by engineers at the Army's Quartermaster Corps. This platform, built from laminated plywood, absorbed the shock of landing through controlled crushing. The wood deformed on impact, dissipating energy that would otherwise transfer to the Jeep's full frame. After landing, the platform's sides were designed to fall away, held by breakaway bolts that sheared under tension. The Jeep would settle onto its own wheels, free and functional. Inside the vehicle, every component was checked and double-checked. Batteries were strapped down, fuel lines were reinforced. The steering column was locked during descent to prevent damage. Even the tires were inflated to specific pressures to handle the landing force without blowing out. The entire system weighed 3,100 pounds and cost roughly $2,000 per drop, including the Jeep, parachutes, platform, and rigging. It was expensive, but it worked. The Germans did not just see vehicles dropping from the sky. They saw the symbol of American industrial power falling on them like rain. Every Jeep that landed was a message. The United States could afford to throw machinery out of airplanes. They could waste resources on experiments, on innovations, on systems that seemed absurd. The German war economy, by 1945, was collapsing. Factories were bombed, fuel was scarce. Vehicle production had slowed to a trickle. Horses were pulling artillery again. And yet the Americans were dropping brand new Jeeps into combat zones as casually as supply crates. The psychological impact was profound. German soldiers, already demoralized by years of retreat and loss, saw these drops and understood what they meant. The enemy was not just stronger. The enemy was so much stronger that they could afford to be wasteful. Captured German troops later told interrogators that the sight of airdropped vehicles convinced them the war was unwinnable. One Wehrmacht corporal, taken prisoner near Wesel, said he knew Germany had lost the moment he saw a Jeep drive away from a parachute drop. Not because the vehicle itself was dangerous, but because it represented a nation that could do the impossible as routine. March 24, 1945, Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history. Over 16,000 American and British paratroopers dropped east of the Rhine River to secure bridgeheads for advancing Allied ground forces. The sky filled with aircraft, C-47s, C-46s, gliders, stretched across miles. German anti-aircraft fire rose in black clouds. Fighters dove through the formations. Transports exploded mid-air, tumbling in flames. Men and machines fell together. The drop zones were fields and farmland near the towns of Wesel and Hammenkeln, already pulverized by days of artillery bombardment. Smoke from burning villages drifted low. Visibility was poor. Radio communication was chaotic. And into this maelstrom, the Americans dropped their Jeeps. Sergeant Tom Reardon watched from the door of his C-47 as the cargo bundles released. He was the jump master, responsible for ensuring his stick of paratroopers exited cleanly after the equipment. The Jeep bundle tumbled out, trailing static lines. The parachutes snapped open with a sound like thunder. The bundle W hung beneath the canopies, descending toward a field marked by colored smoke. Reardon did not wait to see it land. He gave the signal. His men jumped. 12 paratroopers leapt into the roar and chaos, their own chutes deploying, their bodies jerked upright by the harnesses. Reardon jumped last, plummeting through the noise and smoke, watching tracers arc past. He landed in a cabbage field, rolled, unhooked his chute, and ran for the nearest cover, a ditch filled with other troopers, all firing at German positions 200 yards away. The firefight was immediate and brutal. Above them, German pilots were arriving. A pair of Focke-Wulf 190s screamed through the transport formations, cannons hammering. A C-47 burst into flame, trailing smoke, falling slowly. Another took hits in the wing but kept flying. The fighters climbed, banked, and dove again. One pilot, Oberleutnant Bergmann, ignored the transports and focused on the cargo drops. He had orders to disrupt the operation any way possible. He watched the bundles fall, watched the parachutes bloom. He saw one bundle land near a road. He saw figures running toward it. He saw the parachutes collapse. And then he saw the impossible. The vehicle drove away. Bergman thumbed his radio. His wingman confirmed. They both saw it. Other pilots chimed in, voices tense and confused. One pilot, Lieutenant Werner Schiller, broke formation and dove toward a jeep that was racing across an open field. American soldiers clinging to the sides. Schiller opened fire. His 20mm rounds tore up the dirt, walking toward the jeep. The driver swerved. Schiller overshot, pulled up, banked hard. By the time he circled back, the jeep had disappeared into a tree line. Schiller climbed away, fuel gauge dropping, and radioed his observation to base. The response was static, then silence. No one knew what to make of it. On the ground, the jeeps were changing everything. Sergeant Reardon's unit, pinned in the ditch by German machine gun fire, heard the sound of an engine. A jeep roared up from behind, skidding to a stop in the mud. The driver was a corporal from another company, his face blackened with soot. A .30 caliber machine gun was mounted on a post behind the passenger seat. The gunner opened fire, raking the German positions. The enemy guns fell silent. Reardon and his men sprinted forward, crossing the open ground, reaching the German trench. The fight was over in seconds. The jeep moved on, carrying ammunition to another unit. Reardon never saw it again, but it had saved his life. Across the drop zones, the same scene repeated. Jeeps arrived minutes after the paratroopers, carrying heavy weapons, medical supplies, radios. They evacuated wounded. They towed anti-tank guns into position. They linked scattered units into coherent fighting forces. By noon, the 17th Airborne Division had secured its objectives. By nightfall, ground forces had crossed the Rhine and linked up with the airborne troops. The operation was a success. The German response was fractured and desperate. Local commanders, already overwhelmed by the scale of the Allied assault, received confusing reports from their forward positions. American paratroopers were consolidating faster than expected. They had vehicles, heavy weapons, and mobility within minutes of landing. Counterattacks that should have isolated and destroyed the airborne troops instead ran into organized defenses backed by machine gun-armed jeeps. German infantry, advancing on foot or in half-tracks, were ambushed by fast-moving American units that struck and vanished before artillery could respond. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers, trained to exploit the vulnerability of airborne forces, found themselves facing an enemy that behaved like mechanized infantry. Oberst Friedrich Kohler, commanding a reserve Panzer Grenadier battalion near Wiesel, received orders to counterattack the American drop zones at 1400 hours. His unit moved out, 2 companies of infantry supported by 3 Stoogie 3 assault guns. They advanced along a farm road, expecting to encounter scattered paratroopers. Instead, they were hit by coordinated fire from multiple directions. Jeeps mounting 50 caliber machine guns appeared on their flanks, firing and withdrawing before his men could react. The assault guns opened fire, but the jeeps were too fast, too nimble. They vanished into the orchards and reappeared elsewhere. Kohler's advance stalled. By 1600 hours, he had lost 30 men and 1 assault gun to a mine. He pulled back, radioed for air support, and received no answer. The Luftwaffe had nothing left to give. That night, Kohler wrote in his after-action report, "The enemy displayed unexpected mobility and firepower. Their airborne units were equipped with light vehicles that appeared to have been delivered by air. This capability allowed them to concentrate forces rapidly and evade counterattack. Without armor or air support, further offensive action is inadvisable." The report reached division headquarters, was summarized, and forwarded to Army Group Command. It joined hundreds of other reports describing the same phenomenon. The Americans were dropping vehicles. The implications were discussed at staff meetings. Some officers argued it was a temporary advantage, dependent on perfect conditions. Others saw it as a harbinger. If the Americans could drop jeeps, what else could they deliver by air? Tanks, artillery, entire battalions with full equipment? The question went unanswered. Germany no longer had the resources to counter such innovations. The Reich was collapsing. The Rhine was lost. The war was ending. For the American airborne forces, the jeep drops had proven their worth beyond doubt. After-action reports from Operation Varsity highlighted the speed of consolidation and the reduction in casualties. Units equipped with air-dropped jeeps suffered 20% fewer losses in the first 6 hours after landing compared to units relying solely on gliders or foot movement. Wounded soldiers were evacuated faster, reducing deaths from shock and blood loss. Heavy weapons reached forward positions in time to repel German counterattacks. Communication improved because radio jeeps could move between units, relaying messages and coordinating fire support. The division commander, Major General William Miley, personally commended the rigger crews and pilots who had delivered the vehicles. He requested expanded use of the system for future operations. But there were no future airborne operations. Varsity was the last. Within weeks, Allied ground forces overran Germany. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The Jeep drops, a technological marvel born of necessity, had their moment and then faded into history. The immediate tactical success of airdrop Jeeps was undeniable. Captured German documents, analyzed by Allied intelligence after the war, revealed the extent of enemy confusion and demoralization. Interrogation reports from Wehrmacht prisoners consistently mentioned the speed and mobility of American airborne forces. One Fallschirmjäger officer captured near Wesel stated that he had expected to fight isolated paratroopers armed only with light weapons. Instead, his unit encountered what he described as fully mechanized troops with machine guns and radios. He estimated the Americans had moved 3 times faster than anticipated, making it impossible to surround them. Another report from a German regimental commander noted that counterattacks planned within 2 hours of the airborne landing were preempted by American forces that had already consolidated and prepared defensive positions. The commander concluded that the enemy possessed an unknown method of rapid vehicle delivery. Luftwaffe intelligence was equally perplexed. Post-mission debriefings with pilots who had observed the Rhine crossings included detailed descriptions of cargo bundles descending under parachutes and then moving under their own power. Some intelligence officers initially dismissed these accounts as pilot error or fatigue-induced hallucinations, but the reports were too numerous and too consistent. A formal assessment, dated April 1945, concluded that the Americans had developed a system for airdropping light vehicles, likely jeeps, and that this capability represented a significant advancement in airborne warfare. The report recommended that Germany develop countermeasures, including targeted anti-aircraft fire on cargo planes and immediate artillery strikes on drop zones. These recommendations were never implemented. Germany lacked the resources, the time, and the industrial capacity. The war was over. For the American military, the success of the Jeep drops validated years of experimentation and investment. The Army's Quartermaster Corps compiled comprehensive statistics on the operations. During Operation Varsity alone, 34 Jeeps were dropped by parachute. Of these, 28 landed successfully and were operational within 10 minutes. 4 were destroyed on impact due to parachute malfunctions or landing on obstacles. 2 landed in the Rhine River and were lost. The success rate was 82%, well above the initial projections of 60%. The cost per successful delivery, including aircraft time, rigging, and the vehicle itself, was approximately $2,400. By comparison, delivering a Jeep by glider cost $3,500 and carried higher risks of total loss. The parachute method was faster, safer, and more efficient. Recommendations were made to expand the program, develop larger parachutes for heavier vehicles, and integrate airdrop capabilities into standard airborne doctrine. But the end of the war changed priorities. With Germany defeated and Japan on the brink of collapse, the urgency behind airborne innovation evaporated. The massive airborne divisions, built at great expense, were demobilized. Thousands of paratroopers returned to civilian life. The glider program was terminated. Aircraft were mothballed. The Jeep drop system, despite its success, was quietly shelved. Post-war military planners focused on new threats and new technologies. The atomic bomb, jet aircraft, and guided missiles dominated strategic thinking. Airborne operations, once seen as cutting edge, seemed outdated. The Cold War demanded different capabilities. The lessons learned over the Rhine were filed away in archives, studied briefly by staff officers, and then forgotten. The men who had jumped, who had driven those Jeeps away from collapsing parachutes, went home. Some wrote memoirs. Some spoke at veteran gatherings. Most simply moved on. But they remembered. They remembered the sound of engines starting in the middle of a battlefield. They remembered the speed, the mobility, the feeling that they could fight and win because someone had figured out how to drop a machine from the sky and make it work. The technological legacy of airdrop jeeps extended far beyond World War II. In the years immediately following the conflict, military engineers in the United States continued refining the concept. The lessons learned from Varsity and earlier operations informed the development of improved parachute systems capable of handling heavier loads. By the early 1950s, during the Korean War, the U.S. Air Force successfully dropped light artillery pieces, supply trailers, and even small bulldozers by parachute. The same principles pioneered with the Jeep, reinforced platforms, multi-canopy systems, breakaway cradles, were scaled up and adapted. The evolution continued through the Cold War, culminating in the low-altitude parachute extraction system, LAPES, and later the Joint Precision Airdrop System, JPADS, technologies that allowed precision delivery of vehicles and equipment in hostile environments. None of these advancements would have been possible without the foundational work done in 1944 and 1945. Other nations took notice. Soviet military observers studying American airborne tactics after the war incorporated similar concepts into their own doctrine. The Soviet Union developed its own air-droppable vehicles, including the ASU-57 airborne assault gun and later the BMD series of infantry fighting vehicles. These systems were designed specifically for delivery by parachute, with low profiles, lightweight armor, and reinforced suspensions. The Soviets recognized what the Americans had proven. Airborne forces needed mobility and firepower to survive behind enemy lines. By the 1960s, Soviet airborne divisions were among the most mechanized in the world, capable of deploying entire battalions with organic vehicle support via heavy-lift aircraft. The concept of air mobility, once a risky experiment over the Rhine, had become a cornerstone of global military strategy. The psychological impact of the Jeep drops, though harder to quantify, was equally significant. For the German soldiers who witnessed them, the drops symbolized the overwhelming industrial and technological superiority of the Allies. Post-war interviews with Wehrmacht veterans frequently cited American logistical capabilities as the decisive factor in Germany's defeat. One former Panzer Grenadier officer, interviewed in 1952, described watching American airborne operations and realizing that his own army, struggling to fuel its remaining vehicles, could never compete with a nation that casually threw jeeps out of airplanes. The drops became a symbol, a story told and retold, of the moment when the old ways of war were superseded by something new. For the American soldiers, the memory was different. The Jeep drops represented ingenuity, adaptability, and the willingness to try the impossible. Veterans of the 17th and 82nd Airborne Divisions spoke with pride about the system, about the riggers who packed the chutes and the pilots who delivered them on target. Reunions of airborne units often featured discussions of specific drops, specific jeeps, specific moments when a vehicle arrived exactly when needed. The drops were proof that the military could innovate under pressure, that engineers and soldiers working together could solve problems that seemed insurmountable. That legacy, intangible but real, shaped the culture of the U.S. Army's airborne community for decades. By the 21st century, the airdrop jeeps of World War II had faded into historical footnote. Modern airborne forces rely on helicopters, tilt-rotor aircraft, and advanced logistics systems that dwarf the capabilities of 1945. The C-47 Skytrains that once carried jeeps across the Rhine are museum pieces. The riggers who perfected the art of bundling vehicles for parachute delivery have passed away. But the principle remains. When the 173rd Airborne Brigade conducted a combat jump into northern Iraq in 2003, they brought vehicles with them, Humvees delivered by heavy drop parachute, using systems directly descended from the Jeep drops of 1945. The technology had evolved. The mission had not. Deliver mobility to paratroopers. Give them the tools to fight, survive, and win. The men who drove those jeeps away from the Rhine would have understood perfectly. The image of a jeep descending under a cluster of parachutes, striking the earth, and driving away moments later captures something essential about the American way of war in the 20th century. It was not the largest innovation. It was not the most destructive, but it was emblematic of a mindset that refused to accept limitations. Airborne forces needed vehicles, so vehicles were dropped. The physics were difficult, so engineers solved them. The cost was high, so industry absorbed it. The system worked because people believed it could work, and then made it happen. That willingness to experiment, to take risks, to throw resources at problems until solutions emerged, defined the American military effort in World War II. It built the atomic bomb, the Liberty ships, the radar networks, and yes, the airdropped jeeps. Each innovation, large or small, contributed to victory. For the German pilots who witnessed the drops, the sight must have been both surreal and sobering. They were fighting a nation that could afford to waste jeeps, that could treat vehicles as disposable cargo, that could solve tactical problems with industrial brute force. It was a glimpse of the future, a future in which wars would be won, not by the bravest soldiers or the cleverest generals, but by the economies and systems that could sustain them. The Jeep drops were a message written in steel and nylon. We can do this, and you cannot stop us. That message echoed across battlefields from Normandy to the Rhine, from the hedgerows to the ruins of Berlin. And when the war ended, the message did not fade. It became doctrine, strategy, identity. The legacy of those drops lives on in every military operation that relies on air mobility, rapid deployment, and logistical superiority. It lives on in the helicopters that deliver troops to mountaintops in Afghanistan, in the cargo planes that airdrop supplies to isolated outposts, in the systems that allow modern armies to project power across continents in hours. The technology has changed beyond recognition. But the idea, deliver what is needed, when it is needed, no matter how impossible it seems, that idea was proven over the Rhine in 1945. It was proven by riggers, pilots, engineers, and paratroopers who believed a jeep could fall from the sky and drive away. They were right, and the world has never been the same.